Hello and welcome to The Future Farmer in association with Carrs Billington, leading the industry through people, products and innovation. I'm Nick Wallis, and on each episode I'll be exploring an agricultural topic and discovering the technology that can help bring sustainable and profitable solutions to farming. From the science behind good silage to the efficient management of your milking systems. And here's a taster of what's to come. In this episode...
I love my job because I can see the effect of a change. I've always had this adage that cows don't have a requirement for nutrients. They respond to a change in nutrient supply. And it's when you make that change and you see a benefit, it really is rewarding.
Today, it's all about feeding and managing dry cows. Are we all guilty of underestimating the importance of the dry period and the transitions it involves? And how can we guard ourselves against financial losses? To answer such questions, I'm delighted to say that we're joined on the Future Farmer podcast by Duncan Rose, an expert in agricultural science and previously Chief Technical Manager at Carrs Billington.
My name's Duncan Rose. I'm the Technical Manager for Carrs Billington. Half my working life is on farm. The rest of it is looking at research, developing new products and services and ideas for the company to take forward.
We're looking at dairy cows today and the importance of good management of the dry period and transition into the milking herd. Give us an understanding of why it's so important to get the environmental side of things and the feed side of things exactly right.
The importance of the dry period cannot be overstated. And many dairy farmers believe the cow's producing no milk, therefore she's under no stress. But there's a whole lot going on in the cow, from a sort of hormonal changes, physical changes, and any stressor that disrupts that can have a profound effect on subsequent performance and health of the cow.
And you've guesstimated that over 3/4 of dairy cows in the UK have a compromised dry period. What are the implications for that?
Well, we estimate that three-quarters of dry cows have a compromised dry period. And the consequence of that can be increased milk fever, poor colostrum yields, poor live weight of the calf, reduced milk yields, and other metabolic diseases such as ketosis and fatty liver if the dry cow isn't correctly managed.
So let's go through the basic steps to ensure that people are at least thinking about this and every stage of this that needs to be considered when a cow is in its dry period. What's the first thing to get right?
The first thing to look at is making sure the cows are looked after in a good environment. And dry cows need an environment that provides, adequate space, dry, comfortable bedding, plenty of ventilation, and lighting with ample trough space and clean water. This is particularly important with regard to udder and post-calving infections and for the maintenance of high dry matter intakes through until calving.
Give us an idea of what that would mean on a typical farm. Where would that space be created and how would you maintain it to that level?
The first thing is having a lot of bedded space for the cow to lie down and not close to another cow. She's kept clean. So I've got some environmental guidelines. I know it's sort of bullet points, but I still think it's the best way. Cows should have 10 to 12 square metres of bedded area or 80% occupancy of cubicles. But one's got to think about the surges that can occur in calving. So with an all-around calving herd, calving will be steady week on week. But if you've got a block calving herd, you're going to have a lot of cows calving all at one time. So it's making sure there's enough space. The next thing you need to look at is having enough feed trough space. So, we believe it should be 0.85 to 1 metre of feed trough space per cow, or 80% of the head yoke capacity, remembering that feed troughs should be cleaned out daily.
Why is that feed trough space so important?
It's making sure that there's no hindrance to eating. My guideline, when I look at and measure dry matter intake, cows should be eating about 12 kilos of dry matter all the way through the dry period. Perhaps it drops off the last few days just before calving, but we need to aim for about 12 kilos of dry matter intake. You just simply need to have enough trough space. I mean, bear in mind when the cow is pregnant, she's a little bit wider than she would be otherwise with a 45 kilo calf inside her. so she needs more space. But also from a cleanliness point of view, cubicles need to be large. For a Holstein cow, this I'm talking about, 1.35 meters wide and 2 meters long with a 0.75 meter lunge space. So that enables her to get up easily from a cubicle. So when a cow gets up, she lunges forward. She just doesn't stand up vertically. Bedding needs to be thought about very carefully. If somebody asks me what's the best bedding, well, it's either really deep bedded straw that's replenished every day, or sand. Sand is a very sterile environment. The other important area of the building is literally space. The building needs to be very well ventilated, and if necessary, with additional fans and ventilation, particularly in older buildings where the roof can be quite low. You have quite a few animals in the building. It can be very muggy and very humid. So there are new measures called temperature humidity index. And ideally for a dry cow, that really should be 68 or less. I mean, the numbers have been coming down over the last few years as more research has been done, just showing how detrimental heat and humidity is. Bacteria survive a lot longer in a wet, moist environment than a very arid, dry environment. So I can't emphasize enough how important ventilation and temperature management is for dry cows, and also particularly for high-yielding cows as well.
And water is important as well. Do pregnant cows drink more?
No. Dry cows need at least 50 litres of water per cow per day. When they're milking, they need approximately 3 times their milk yield. So
Okay.
it could be up to 100, 120 litres a day, which is a huge amount of water. So one needs plenty of trough space to allow all the cows to have free access at any time. Even though you may only have a few dry cows in a small area, you really need 2 water troughs per area, because you've got cows that are more timid, maybe heifers are in this group. Water intake is so important. If there isn't sufficient water available, dry matter intake can be depressed, which then leads to energy deficiency.
Okay, so explain the concept then of a just-in-time move.
Is as a new concept, recognizing that we've got to try and minimize the stress on a cow. Every time you move a cow into a new building or a new pen, she's got to cope with competitors. Ideally, if you have a far-off group, a close-up group, and a newly calved group, that these pens are close to one another, and all you have to do is open a gate and move the cow a few feet, and she's in a new group, and that minimizes the stress that can have a huge effect on early calving and effect on dry matter intake.
Great. So that's the environment side of things. Let's talk about the management side. What's the top line here? What do farmers need to be most aware of?
Cows really need a 6-week dry period. So the cows are dried off from being milked, and they need plenty of time for the cow herself, her organs, and particularly the mammary gland to recover after a long 305-day milking. So some farmers will try and curtail the dry period to obviously maximize milk output, but there's a balance. So the cow definitely needs time to recover. For mature cows that have been through the sequence of calving once before, you can get away with shorter dry periods of about 6 weeks. But cows that have been lame or have had some illness, or a heifer that's finished her first lactation, they need more time to recover. So that's where I'm really recommending an 8-week dry period as opposed to a shorter 6-week period. Any less than 6 weeks, we are not giving the mammary gland time to recover, so that next time around, milk yield is maximised.
But also could compromise the colostrum yield.
Yes. The other reason for ensuring having a sensible dry period of 6 to 8 weeks is to maximise colostrum yield, colostrum quality, and first week's milk protein yields as well.
So moving on to the way that you get optimum performance out of the cows when you're going through this dry cow period, you're recommending these separate house groups, the far off and the close up groups.
On balance, my recommendation to have the most successful dry cow management is to have the dry cow period split into 2 periods. Cows are dried off, then they have a 5 to 6 week period, and then 3 weeks prior to calving, they need to be moved to what we call a transition group. And this is where we have to modify the diet as the cow approaches calving, and we'll start putting in more nutrients in terms of energy and protein and vitamins and minerals to help the mammary gland grow, to feed the calf, to make sure the calf is as healthy as possible when it's born, and also you're maximising colostrum yields and milk protein yields. And if you don't have high milk yields in the early part of lactation, you don't get high yields through the rest of lactation. So peak yield determines total lactational yield. So the transition period has a huge impact on that, and that's often underestimated.
I was going to say, because given how important that is, it's something that can be, I imagine, overlooked.
Yes, the reason the dry period is underestimated is because she isn't seen to be productive at that point in time. She's not producing any milk. But as more science comes through and new knowledge, the response to good dry cow management is just totally obvious in measuring all sorts of diseases and production indices.
What are the advantages and disadvantages of managing heifers in a separate group?
They're smaller. They'll be more stressed by changes in environment, and possibly the diet needs to be changed to more precisely meet their requirements. But often farms do not have the facilities to have a far-off group, a transition group, and an early calving group. And so when you start trying to micromanage one or two heifers separately can be a problem. But on very large herds, particularly those in the States and some larger herds in the UK, they do have facilities to manage heifers separately. And all we're trying to do is minimize the stress. And it is more stressful for a heifer than a cow. She hasn't got the experience, and every new change, a change in lighting, a change in building, a change in bedding, moving her to a new accommodation is all a stress. And these stress hormones can have a negative effect on other hormones in the body, and that's still yet to be fully understood.
So when you're going through this management of a dry cow and you're observing what's happening, what should you be looking to evaluate and record as you go along in order to make sure that you do have a healthy dry cow?
There are a number of key performance indicators. There's the buzzword that
the KPIs.
Yeah,
that goes through every industry, right? In the 21st century, what are your KPIs?
The KPIs I start looking at now when I walk around the dairy farm are looking at body condition score. So how much fat the cow has on her back. You don't want a cow to be too fat because that will depress dry matter intake. So when the cow is newly calved, it can lead to fatty liver and ketosis. So the score is from 1 to 5. 1 is really thin and 5 is far too fat. And so the ideal body condition score is 3, from drying off all the way through to calving, if that can be sustained. Once the cow calves down, she now is producing a huge amount of milk quite quickly, and she can lose a little bit of body weight. So if she's too thin to start with, she doesn't have the reserves to pull on. At the other extreme, if the cow is too fat, that will have a negative effect on her dry matter intake. So even though she's got huge reserves, that actually has a detrimental effect on dry matter intake. The other really important measure is rumen fill, and that's really just as it says. If the rumen is full, it'll be full of dry matter, which is what we're wanting the cow to eat. And there's really good correlation between poor rumen fill and poor performance, and really good rumen fill and good performance. So again, so on a score from 1 to 5, 5 is absolutely, you can't get the cow any fuller. So the dry cow really should have very good rumen fill of about 4 all the way through the dry period. She calves down, and then her appetite will be depressed a little bit. And so we'd expect the rumen fill to drop to about 3. but much less than that, where you really just got to start asking the question: are we giving her enough trough space? Is the diet correctly balanced, and so on and so forth? So a rumen fill of 4 through dry period is great. The other areas to look at are how clean cows are. So there's a term called HOC, hygiene score. In other words, how much shit there is on the feet and legs, and again, score from 1 to 5. Cows do produce a fair amount of muck, so you can't have a completely, absolutely clean cow. But you want a score around about less than 3, 5 being very dirty cow, and 1 being not a spot on the cow, on the back legs, nada at all. Milk fever is a very debilitating disease, even subclinical milk fever, where if it's acute, it'll go down and you need to put calcium in the vein to get her back up again. But milk fever, subclinical milk fever that's not easily detected without taking blood samples.
How does it come about?
Milk fever comes about by literally being a shortage of calcium when the cow is producing a lot of milk. So years and years and years ago, before I was born, less well-bred cows, maybe suckler cows, they just don't produce milk nearly as quickly as these very modern Holsteins. So very quickly after calving, milk pours out of the cow, and every litre of milk has grams of calcium in it. So the more milk the cow produces, the more calcium is drained out of the cow. The cow can pull calcium out of her diet, but she can also pull calcium out of her bloodstream and bones. But unless the cow's system is really well adapted, she cannot pull enough calcium out of the diet very quickly, and it can be detrimentally affected by how we feed and manage dry cows. One of the key problems in the UK is high potassium grass silage, and the potassium interferes with calcium mobilization. So one can look to grow forages that are lower in potassium, such as whole crop wheats, maize silage, older grown big bale silage, grow crops or grow grass on land that hasn't been fertilized for a long time and has a low potassium index. So that's a real challenge in the UK, where the predominant forage fed to dry cows is grass silage, and inherently on large dairy farms where there's a lot of slurry put on, there's a lot of potassium going back onto the land, gets taken up by the grass, and you can do nothing about it once it's in the grass. So you need to have different feeding regimes to help overcome that, either by pushing the silage out of the diet with straw or whole crop or maize or even bruised grains. And then if that doesn't work, then we will have to resort to other methods, such as putting anionic salts in the diet.
Now, in freshly calved cows, there are other potential issues: the retained placenta and the displaced abomasum. Explain what those are and how you try and keep the incidence of that down.
Retained placenta is when the cow calves. The calf is born, but the placenta is still held within the womb, and that is related to calcium and magnesium supply. So it is very likely that if you have a retained placenta, you've possibly got a mineral imbalance. It could also be extreme energy shortage, and the cow has not got the energy to expel the placenta as well. But mostly it relates to mineral management. But the KPI values that I have are really for the top 5% of farms. So if you can achieve these, you're in the top 5%.
And let's list those: milk fever incidence less than 5%, retained placenta incidence less than 8%, displaced abomasum less than 2%, and ketosis less than 1%. What does it suggest you're doing wrong if you're getting higher percentages than those KPIs?
Well, as a nutritionist, I'd be saying, you're feeding the cows inadequately, so use me and I'll help solve the problem. But Quite honestly, it isn't that simple. This is where I want to really emphasize the importance of feeding management and the environment, the buildings in which the cows are kept. And you need to look at all three to make sure they're all correct to start, before you start jumping on to say it's that. one must also look at all the other factors it could be. So there's certain diseases like milk fever is related to calcium management. But why is it? Let's say energy intake is low or calcium intake is low. Well, it might be the nutrients within the feeds, but it may be that you aren't feeding, you haven't got enough trough space, or you're not feeding enough water to ensure maximum dry matter intake. So it's very dangerous. Just very quickly, 1 and 1 equals 2.
I get you. So when it comes on to feed, there are some headings here: ration structure and particle size, dry matter content, water supply and quality, grouping and group changes. Again, take us through those and why they're so important, and why you need to look at them in the round and not just individually.
Ration structure is all down to the particle size. So cows' dry matter intakes increase as particle size reduces down to, let's say, less than 2 centimeters. Obviously, if it's powdered dust, then the rumen wouldn't function properly. But grass silage is generally cut, and straw is cut, and hay is cut longer than the rumen needs for good rumen performance. So cows are very good at separating out and picking out the goodies in a diet. So if you've got very unequal particle size, very long particles and very short particles, the cows generally like concentrates. They like the goodies. So they will literally nose round and pick the concentrates out. So let's say I want to put a straw in a cow's diet, in a dry cow diet. Straw has the lowest nutrient density. Cows sort of know this. Even though it's good for them, they'll just nose it out. So you put the straw on the diet, mix it up nicely, and then tomorrow you come and see all the straw's been left. It's like my son, picking out the chocolate out of a chocolate cake,
And they do it without hands.
that's right. So that's where a more even particle size structure, so it's less easy for cows to, and the term is sorting. Cows are very good at sorting.
So the answer to that is uniformity.
Yes. Next thing is you asked about dry matter content. If it's very dry, it's like eating cheese crackers. You need some moisture in the diet. So if you've got very, very dry materials and all concentrates that are purchased are 86% dry matter, and if you've got straw that's 86% dry matter and hay that's 86%, the cows won't find it very appetizing. So when the diet gets drier, we tend to advise, if the farmer's got a feeder wagon, add water to their diet to enhance intake. So the reason I mentioned dry matter content is that if the more extreme higher dry matter cases, because typically grass silage is about 25% dry matter, and that's great. And a couple of kilos concentrates, you don't need to be adding water. But as people feed more wilted silage and higher dry matter forages, then the diet can get too dry. And then that leads on to, for the same reason, water supply is important, as is the quality. Borehole water can be very variable in nutrient content, so it needs to be analysed to check for heavy metals and calcium and potassium content.
We've talked about the sorts of food in terms of dry matter and ration structure and straw, etc. Can we drill down into the different types that are available? I've been dying to talk about cow cake for some time. What's in cow cake?
Cow cake is made from a lot of natural raw materials that are either grown in the UK or they're byproducts from the human food industry. So wheat, barley, oats, sugar beets.
Do they tend to largely have a higher glucose content?
From a dry cow feeding perspective, one needs to look at supplying nutrients that the forages tend not to supply. So grass is a poor source of starch. It has no starch in it. Straw has no starch in it. Hay has no starch in it. And it's important in the last 3 weeks before calving that cows are supplied starch. If you have a deficiency of starch in the diet, then there's a deficiency of glucose in the bloodstream. That's so important for every cell in the body. So it's important to feed an extra starch supplement, which then is either in the concentrates. You can get some starch in forages such as maize silage or whole crop, but even that is not high enough in starch in general to supply enough starch to the dry cow in the last 3 weeks before calving.
And so the dry cow cake provides the starch that it needs to convert into glucose.
Yeah, the dry cow cake or dry cow blend will contain one of a number of starch sources, maize starch or wheat starch or barley starch.
What other specific feeds can be useful for dry cows?
The forages in the main are deficient in most vitamins, minerals and trace elements. I've mentioned earlier on the one mineral that grass and grass silage tends to be too high, and that's potassium. But apart from that, most forages are deficient in vitamins, minerals and trace elements and need to be supplemented either in the dry cow cake, dry cow blend, dry cow minerals, or dry cow licks and dry cow blocks. And it's really important that forages are sent away for not only energy, protein and fiber measurements, but also minerals and vitamins. They can be really, really variable from farm to farm and from field to field. What matters is what each farm has and what those particular dry cows are being fed, because the farm will have first cut silage, second cut silage, third cut silage. You might have bought some silage in from another farm, and they'll all have a different nutrient content.
And I presume part of the Carrs Billington process, you and your colleagues talk to farmers, they assess what their dairy herds need, they look at the land, they look at what they're already getting, and then they can advise, and you can advise on specific changes to diet which will help during that really important dry cow period.
Carrs Billington takes some pride in going right back to the soil and start with soil analysis to try and explain why, when we get a forage analysis back, why is this particularly high in potassium, or why is it particularly low in calcium or magnesium? Yes, it's really important to send forages away to know the nutrient content, but it's the next question is important as well. Why is your forage different to your next door neighbour's forage? What is it you're doing different to the land and your fertiliser policy for that to occur? How can we help rectify that? I can't emphasise enough how important it is to regularly analyse forages and water.
How collaborative is the whole process?
I think there should be a great deal more collaboration between the farmer, his vets and nutritionist. We may think we're experts in each other's area, and I can assure you we're not. We can learn a great deal from one another. So the best performing herds I deal with are where all three of us are working very closely together. We may not be experts in ideal building design, but we say, oh, look, I think we're overstocked here. Dry matter intakes are being compromised, but we know that because we're measuring it. What can we do? And again, the three of us may not have the knowledge there and then, but we would then possibly decide, right, I'll go and find out a really good building designer, bring it back to the party, and we all three discuss it together. So it is very much or it should be a collaborative approach.
You must get a certain amount of job satisfaction when you go in and there's a farmer having a problem, and through your ability to analyse what's going on, you can point them in the right direction and say maybe do more of this, and then watch the results over a period of time.
I love my job because I can see the effect of a change. I've always had this adage that cows don't have a requirement for nutrients; they respond to a change in nutrient supply. And it's when you make that change and you see a benefit, it really is rewarding. I mean, it's not just financially rewarding for the farmer, but it's also just rewarding for me that hopefully I understand what I do. And you say, right, I think it's this. Discuss it with the farmer, agree a plan, and watch the response. And it's with dairy cows, you can see a very quick response. Not so much the dry cow; you've got to wait for the cow to calve down and watch the milk yield. But a dairy cow, you change her energy or protein supply today, and you can see the response tomorrow, the next month, and then we know it's going to have a whole effect on the rest of lactation, the rest of her life. So what you feed a cow today has an effect on her performance today, tomorrow, next week, and next month, and say the rest of her life.
I mean, it is a science, but it's also common sense. What goes in affects what comes out.
Yes, you are. The old adage, you are what you eat.
Duncan, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, that's it. Thanks for listening to the Future Farmer podcast in association with Carrs Billington. For more information about some of the issues discussed in this episode, search for the Carrs Billington website. Once there, you can email with your inquiry, or if you have a question about feeds, machineries, agricultural and rural supplies, or fuels, there are Carrs Billington experts on the other end of the phone. Listen out for future episodes, and don't forget to like and subscribe so we know if we're answering all your questions. I'm Nick Wallis, and until next time, keep safe and keep farming.